Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Linda Schottenstein-Fisher from Chicago. I'm a proud member of the JDC board, and I have the honor of chairing the JDC Archives Committee. Thank you all for being with us today. We welcome you, and we are here today with very heavy thoughts and hearts. And we're all thinking of our brethren and our families and our friends in Israel who are suffering. On behalf of the JDC Archives, I want to personally extend my thoughts and support for those in our community who have been impacted by the horrific attacks on Israel last week. We are all praying for peace for all those suffering. In these challenging times, JDC and the Archives remains committed to not only preserving the past and promoting the rich tapestry of Jewish history, but to protect it. It's important to recognize that throughout the history of the Jewish people, intercommunal solidarity has been a hallmark of the Jewish experience, especially in the Holy Land of Israel, where JDC was founded in 1914 and has been unequivocally aiding in the most vulnerable for more than a century, including even today, as we deplore our emergency responses. We hope this program provides a little respite for all the news that's happening around us. And once again, we stand together at this challenging moment that it faced Jews everywhere in the history of the Jewish people. Our speaker today is Simone Gigliotti. She's a reader in Holocaust Studies in the Department of History at Royal Holloway, University of London in the UK. She's published many books, edited collections and articles on various aspects of the Holocaust and its displacement histories, including deportations, death marches, Jewish refugee experiences, and extensive reportage, collection, retelling, and testimony. Simone's recent book, Restless Archive, The Holocaust and its Cinema of the Displaced, was just released by the Indiana University Press. Today, we are lucky that Simone will lecture on relief supplies and films on the road with JDC's mobile film units in post-war Germany. Dr. Gigliotti will speak for about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Your microphones are turned off, you are on mute, and we will take questions through the Q&A function, which is on your screen. You can send those questions at any time during the lecture, and we will then, at the end of her lecture, answer the questions. Dr. Gigliotti, I will now invite you to start your lecture. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you to the JDC for the invitation to speak to you today. And I wholeheartedly endorse what you just said about the situation in Israel. I'm now going to share my screen. When the SS Marine Flasher, a former troop transport ship, brought close to 800 Holocaust survivors from post-war Europe to New York on May 20, 1946, news coverage about it was plentiful. The JDC had funded the passage of several hundred people on this momentous voyage, the first of many to bring displaced persons, hereafter DPs, to the United States under the Truman Directive between 1946 and 1948. In addition to the passengers were goods of immense cultural value, including unpublished manuscripts in Yiddish, earmarked for donation to YIVO. Holocaust survivors formed most passengers on this voyage, and they reported their stories of Nazi tortures in newspaper outlets and to relief officers. Just a few days after the arrival of that voyage, on May 25, 1946, the Marine Flasher returned to Europe. On board were several films marked as cargo, including Henry Lynn's Bar Mitzvah and a filmed version of the cantorial short Yiddische Lied. These films would soon transcend their designation as cargo to become a therapeutic good, Once delivered to JDC officials in Europe, they contributed to an extremely popular but little-known JDC-sponsored film program to Holocaust survivors in displaced persons camps in post-war Germany. This program ran from late 1945 to late 1949. Operating mainly in the US zone of occupied Germany, the program expanded on a smaller scale into Austria, Italy, and the British and French zones of Germany. An amazing range of feature and documentary films were included in this relief program, what I will call a mobile cinematheque. In addition to Yiddish films, there were comedies, Hollywood romances, musicals, and westerns from obviously the United States, dramas and thrillers from Europe, and films especially from Poland and the Soviet Union. These film screenings triggered and energized the Jewish DPs, as the films often evoked the trauma of their past experiences and anticipated their migration futures. So what were the ambitions, challenges, and geography of this extensive cultural relief program in post-war Germany? So today's presentation provides early thoughts on that question. It is top-heavy, meaning it's a reconstruction using the JDC's archives and supplemented with material from others. The analysis has certain gaps that I'm continuing to fill, such as the reception of the JDC's film program among the Jewish DPs and in local German communities, and also the contributions of the DPs themselves in assisting the JDC. For reference, the topic of the JDC's film program is treated in depth in chapter 5 of my recent book, Restless Archive, which Linda mentioned. And that chapter includes some digital maps of the JDC's relief operations and the zones and cities where the film program operated. I'm going to be referring to some of these in my talk. If you look at the slides that will come up, they have an orange font. These are the ones that are digitized, and these links will be available at the start of the chat session in the Q&A after the talk. So when I began researching the topic of the film units, I was intrigued by the JDC's archival classification of film as relief supplies. Film viewing for Holocaust survivors and now displaced persons carried an emotional and cathartic pull. The substantial number of American films on offer reflected the influence of the United States' reach into post-war Germany, a kind of soft power intrusion or a cultural Americanization of DP camp spaces. And it created new opportunities to view Eastern European and American Yiddish cinema. The mainstream Hollywood films screened in the JDC's program were sourced from American film studios, including MGM, Universal, Columbia, and RKO, independent producers, distributors in New York and Los Angeles, and from the United States Army offices in Frankfurt, in Germany. To secure and screen these films and obtain the necessary screening equipment and spaces, the JDC developed partnerships with the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in the US zone of Germany, who are the main representative body of Holocaust survivors. Also with the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, hereafter UNRWA, and the US Army. The Army indeed played a very important role. As with its approach to DP camp management after the liberation, it would eventually relinquish control of films that circulated between DP camps and supplied the JDC with movie projector equipment and technical expertise needed to deliver this film screening program. These practices emanated from its own screening programs during and after the war. For example, by the end of World War II, the US Army had instituted a global distribution network of portable cinema screenings that coordinated the transport of thousands of film rooms from its 260 film libraries to 60 military bases on 6 continents. Films arrived to bases worldwide by boat, plane, train, automobile, motorcycle, and other means. The provision of portable cinemas and equipment in post-war Germany was therefore not so unusual, as it continued the Army's wartime activities and represented what film scholar Heidi Vossen calls suitcase cinema. In this case, the mobility of relief in the field now serviced the cultural appetites of occupying military forces and displaced persons. The JDC's film screening program was innovative in its merging of the mechanics of movie projection with the slowed down motion of Holocaust survivors in DP camps. The Special Services Unit of the JDCs, which was responsible for the mobile film operations, created these viewing spaces within the larger political geography of displacement and post-war rebuilding. The supply, viewing, and circulation of these films exemplified a kind of battleground for the control and access to restorative and communal space for Jewish DPs in the wake of the Holocaust. Jewish DP's enthusiasm for these films exemplifies an affirmation of a long-established theme in Holocaust scholarship called "We Are Here," which refers to the surviving remnant, the phrase given to Holocaust survivors after the war. And this theme in scholarship has existed since the early 1990s. One of its proponents, Abraham Peck, outlined that the surviving remnant espoused an activist vision foregrounding resistance, affirmation, and vigilance that connected DP's communities across Germany, Austria, and Italy. These are Jewish DP communities. Yet differences abounded too, as the varying national and ethnic backgrounds of displaced persons influenced the political and cultural bent of films screened to them. The JDC's film program was particularly significant in its prioritization of sourcing Yiddish films for screenings. It drew on the rich library of Yiddish films from interwar Poland, a film production base that was destroyed by the Holocaust, and introduced audiences to Yiddish filmmaking that had flourished in the United States in silent and sound form. In Bridge of Light, Yiddish Film Between Two Worlds, the film critic Jay Hoberman argues that Yiddish cinema projected, quote, not just a national cinema without a nation state, but a national cinema that with every presentation created its own ephemeral nation state, end of quote. Perhaps we can read these film screenings too, with each projection, as the formation of transient nation states of Jewish displaced persons, except this time in the now protected environs of a country that once wanted to destroy them. Most of the Yiddish films screened to Jewish DPs, such as A Letter to Mother, Yiddle with His Fiddle, Two Sisters, and The Dybbuk, came from what Jay Hoberman called the fourth phase and golden age of Yiddish film production. This phase began in Poland in 1935 and continued in dialogue with New York until World War II ended the market. The Film Relief Program, I'm just going to go to this next slide so you can see what I'm going to be speaking about. The Film Relief Program in post-war Germany formed part of the JDC's provision of activities to Holocaust survivors that contributed to the resurgence of cultural life in DP camps. So this slide on the screen, what you're seeing now, it shows the JDC operations on the left of the screen in this original map from January 1948. And part of my objective was to insert and restore the JDC's mobile film units to this map. So I've created a digital map of the map you see on the left is roughly geolocated on the right-hand side, all with the same categories of district offices, hospitals, children's homes, communities. And then I've inserted the mobile film units, areas of operation into that map. And these links will be available later on in the talk. So the films that comprise this mobile cinematheque shifted from a territorial good to a communal good, a relief item to be loaned between different authorities and DP camps' cultural leaders. Vital to this transition was the influence of JDC officials in Paris, Munich, and New York in consultation with the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in Germany. Many JDC-affiliated individuals, such as Koppel Pinson, Leo Schwartz, and Joseph J. Schwartz, who's the director of the European operations, are well known for their leadership efforts, but less so for their contribution ensuring that Jewish DPs had access to the latest film releases. So having given you an idea of this, the contours of this program, I'm going to turn to the incubation and the kind of relief operations and the map and how it actually unfolded. So 4 months after liberation in May 1945, the revival of Yiddish film viewing became a priority in the JDC's correspondence. Discussions about securing films for screening to Jewish DPs prioritized not just Yiddish films, but also their complicated transnational supply network. A cable dated September 15, 1945, from Joseph Schwartz, the director of the JDC's operations in Europe, underscores the urgency that would become synonymous with JDC communications between Paris and New York related to sourcing films. Schwartz strongly urged teams to secure whatever Yiddish films are available for camps. Major Judah Nadick, a special consultant on Jewish affairs to the US Army, made a month-long tour of DP camps in Germany in August 1945 and reported his findings about the potential of film as relief. He noted that, and I'm quoting him, movies could be a welcome form of diversion, but camps have neither projectors and screens nor films. Feldafing has a 16mm sound projector, but the 3rd Army Special Service states it is not permitted to loan films to displaced persons' camps. End of quote. So Nadick further identified the following problems in relation to the supply of films, and these will come up as the talk progresses, namely their sourcing in New York from independent and Jewish-owned film companies and from film studios in Los Angeles, and the time that it would take to ship them to Europe, the jurisdiction of these films once they had actually arrived in the US zone in Germany. Thirdly, the lack of suitable projection equipment and technical operators to screen them in the DP camps. Fourthly, the lack of large halls to accommodate the screenings and the demand. And finally, the JDC officials' attitudes towards film and the types of content they prioritized and marginalized. So this was what you're seeing on the screen now was kind of one of the first announcements of the return of Yiddish films since the Nazi ban. So it took a year to progress from discussing the possibility of screening Yiddish films to actually doing so. And when that happened, the headlines were justifiably dramatic. Berlin sees Yiddish films for the first time since Nazi ban. As reported in the August 8, 1946 issue of Stars and Stripes, the US Army's magazines, the first films to be screened to residents of the Duppel DP camp and to German Jews in the US zone of Berlin were the American Yiddish classics, Two Sisters and Marilla F. Ross, the latter adapted from Jacob Gordon's 1898 play. Both of these films became firm favorites among Jewish DPs in the early post-war years. Thereafter, the film screening diversified, though not without its difficulties. Correspondence between the JDC officials in New York, Paris, and Munich reveals the commercial imperatives and aesthetic judgments that influenced the film selection. So one of those kind of constraints was the usage of these films. So for example, the Cinema Service Corporation advised the JDC that non-commercial exhibitors could not obtain films for any longer than one evening. Yet David Gross relayed in a memo that an exemption on usage and cost, $200 US dollars was the cost per film, would be made for the GDC on the condition of films were exhibited only within the confines of DP camps in Germany and Austria and were destroyed once no longer needed to avoid commercial misuse. The Cinema Service Corporation sent Gross a list of 9 American Yiddish productions, but Gross seemed unimpressed, and he wrote, I'm quoting from him, "These films are by no means of a very high caliber. I recall having seen 1 or 2 fine Yiddish motion pictures many years ago, which were produced in Poland, but no one whom I spoke to in the film industry seems to know where these films could be obtained, if at all. May I add a suggestion of my own, namely that there are numerous films in English picturing life in Palestine today, which have been produced by the Jewish National Fund, Hadassah, and other Zionist organizations. Most of these are of very fine quality, and in my personal opinion, would be a great deal more appreciated than the Yiddish films described above." End of quote. Well, he then added a postscript talking about how about Yiddish captions. So one of the areas I need to investigate further is about the kind of captioning on non-Yiddish language films. So although American Yiddish productions were included in the JDC's film program, Polish Yiddish films were prioritized in programming. Gross's apparent distaste for Yiddish films from the United States did not extend to films that promoted these immigration futures in Palestine. Thus, the screening program's curation reflected not just a supply and demand situation, but more so a mediation of the roots and trajectories of Yiddish cinema from its Eastern European origins to its apparently less authentic and desirable diasporic destinations. So the privileging of Eastern European Yiddish films for selection in the film screening program was echoed in Koppel-Pinson's memos. He was a historian of German and Jewish history. He taught in various colleges of the City University of New York. He also assisted Jewish refugees in the 1930s and 40s and was the JDC's education director for Jewish GPs in Germany and Austria. He notes that the problem of securing Yiddish films of decent quality, as he said, meaning Polish in origin, additionally related to the lack of centralized location or repository. These films were without a home, dispersed among what he said, banks, receivers, storage companies. And he said only a person in the business can really lay his hands on the films desired. End of quote. So the absence of a custodial home for Yiddish films in the United States translated into Pinson's recommendation for a type of repatriation of Yiddish films from their dispersed locations and centralization in a distribution agency. He settled on Leo Seligman, who was able to source 15 Yiddish titles for rental and transport to Europe. Pinson further recommended cooperation with the Jewish Welfare Board on a film share program, as the JWB, the Jewish Welfare Board, had been working on a large-scale program of Yiddish films for servicemen overseas. The JWB was a social and religious support network for Jewish service members abroad. Their reliance on film viewings continued the purpose of the US Army film screenings to nurture cultural connections to home among Jewish soldiers and other service members and to perpetuate Yiddish culture. Cables from April 1946 reported frustrations about securing the right size projector for films due to a shortage of the desired 35mm projectors. Consulting with the US Army and the UNRWA for screening rights, securing distribution deals and usage rights with foreign distributors, and deciding which films were suitable for DPs from the extensive list of American offerings. These teething issues would be eventually resolved with the emergence of a streamlined system in January 1947 and the establishment of mobile film units to tour the US zone. This shift from improvisation to semi-professionalism in the delivery of the film screening program included the evolution of a booking service, the stocking of film prints in the JDC's film library in Munich, and the identification of films with high demand and priority circulation. So one of the most persistent challenges in all of the correspondence that I've read that permeated the film screening program was the supply of film projectors. So in a letter on June 5, 1946, going back to its origins, Elliot Sass, Director of Supply and Transportation for the JDC's Paris office, indicated that requests for more films were being received from the field and that these films should be supplied in 16mm because of the shortage of 35mm projections. Then we had additional memos from Jacob Joslow, and he contradicted this request. He said that 35mm films could again be used because of the availability of a projector and the use of local theatres. So this backtracking in request exemplifies the tenor of the correspondence, shaped as it was by last-minute availability of suitable screening equipment and local halls in which to watch the films. So the extra capacity in physical space and film projector size also accounts for why some films were advertised as having up to 3 screenings a day, a frequency no doubt aided by the Office of Film Censorship in Germany, which stipulated that films circulating in the US zone under the JDC's cultural program were exempt from a special screening license. Film trailers in Yiddish and English were often shown before screenings, as were World in Film or Welt in Film newsreels. These were Anglo-American produced newsreels for screening to civilian populations in post-war Germany and Austria. These Welt in Film newsreels were widely used as part of the Allies' civilian re-education programs that focused on democratization and denazification, often without much success, as scholars such as Ulrike Weckel have discussed. So the demand for films in the program continued to outpace supply. The intended reach of the film program was also threatened by a lack of transport vehicles and the limited number of copies in circulation. Herbert Kutsky, an American-born banker who worked for the JDC in New York and the War Refugee Board, was based in the JDC's Arleston office. And his letter of July 16, 1946, lauded the popularity of the initiative, stating that the films are being requested all over the British and American zones in Berlin. A regular booking scheme has had to be established, and the films are constantly in use. The difficulties of the vehicle supply reduce the film screenings frequency. So showing a picture in Berlin, even for 1 week, would take the film out of circulation for almost 3 weeks, allowing a week to get the film to Berlin and a week for its return. This letter from Katsky restates the request for an increase in the number of titles, especially Yiddish films. Another contributor to the delivery of the JDC's film program was Jacob Joslow, who I've mentioned, and he was a former high school principal from Massachusetts. He was recruited to the JDC in New York, Paris, and then Munich. I looked at his oral history interview from the JDC and others, which does not really go into much detail about his film program contribution, though his empathy with the DPs is clear. He said, and I'm quoting him, he said, "Here I was in Germany with no clear-cut idea of needs. In fact, I did not even know what a camp looked like, nor what the individual desires of the inmates of the camps were. My only contacts with displaced persons were those who came to the office, but they did not come for education, they came for relief. I saw immediately that the needs of these poor people were food, clothing, and shelter, and they had absolutely no interest in, nor request for, action in the education field." End of quote. Echoing the words of other relief workers and officers in DP camps, Joslow declared in the same interview was that the biggest problems were the personal problems with the individual who had gone through such a devastating period during their life or hiding in the camps. Film, therefore, became a surrogate educational medium, a balm to fill the gaps of teachers, supplies, and funding. So Joslow's outrage then at what appeared to derail the program was implicit in a letter from July 30, 1946, written by the JDC's Director of European Operations, Joseph Schwartz, which revealed that all 16mm films had been withdrawn from UNRWA by the US forces, the Special Services offices in Frankfurt, and returned to that office at the request of the Army Motion Picture Service Army headquarters in Washington, D.C. Awaiting imminent shipment to the United States, their abrupt relocation threatened to end the JDC's nascent film program, into which so much effort had already been invested. So news of this crisis reached Edward Warburg, the JDC's chair in New York, who on August 8, 1946, cabled Louis B. Mayer, head of MGM Studios in Culver City, Los Angeles, and urgently requested that these American films not be withdrawn, insisting that they must remain available for the use in the JDC screening program. There is little correspondence to suggest that the issue was resolved quickly, as subsequent letters detail Mayer's unresponsiveness, the limited availability of Yiddish films, and the much promoted first screenings of American Yiddish films in August 1946. So the impending withdrawal of American films placed pressure on whatever existing films were in circulation, particularly Yiddish films, and it also meant sourcing new titles. The demand for diversity in the film offer came from a new source, surviving Jews from Eastern Europe who crossed into the US zone of Germany. As Samuel Haber wrote in a memo to Jacob Joslow on August 18, 1946, he wrote, "The pressing need for additional film titles is increasing daily, especially in view of the emergency need created by the infiltree centres now springing up. Requests have come in from various sources for films to be shown in these centres as a stopgap recreation device." So Haber urgently requested additional prints of already approved and popular films, since any new film titles would be subject to review and thus delayed for use. Additional prints in 16mm and 35mm were requested of the already approved films, Green Fields, Morello Frost, Cantor Son, Bar Mitzvah, and Two Sisters. Another supply challenge was the physical capacity of the screening halls, which spaces would be large enough to accommodate the DPs, to house the adequately sized screens, and have trained cinema operators. These elements were addressed in various memos and cables that reported on developments aimed at delivering an expanded and borderless relief program. In a letter of August 18, 1946, Joslow reported to Morris Eigen in the JDC's office in New York that, he said, in the matter of Yiddish films, arrangements have been completed throughout the US and British zones for the use of GI and German theatres for the showing of 35mm films. That means we can use both 16 and 35mm films in any quantity. I know that you will do your best to enlarge our film library. End of quote. So the report did not specify whether US soldiers or Germans were invited to any of these screenings. So this is another area for future research. So the JDC's film program was transitioning to professionalization, but the organization not yet received a response regarding the use of those American films that I mentioned before that were being held by the US Army, which could be regarded as a detained collection of mass entertainment. The future custody of these films was further discussed in correspondence of late August 1946 between the US Army, the UNRWA, the Motion Picture Association of America, and this association represented the major studios. As it transpired, the MPAA, this Motion Picture Association, entrusted custody of these films to the US Army, which actually no longer wanted the responsibility and recommended that they be removed from circulation. But the MPAA was also happy for these films to remain if there was a suitable alternative custodian, that being the UNRWA. So doing this would mean the development of new contractual relations between the UNRWA and approximately 50 independent film producers. The JDC saw an element of goodwill in acquiring and screening these American films, yet most of them had nothing to do with immigration, Zionism, or the Jewish experience, and some of them did not screen as frequently as Yiddish films. So while waiting for a response on the supply of American films, Yiddish films continued to be screened in the film relief program, and new ones such as the Purim Spieler and Yidel with his fiddle were awaiting shipment from a warehouse in New York to the JDC office in Munich. Some of the Yiddish films were damaged in transit between DP camps as part of the mobile film program, such as Morella Frost. And obviously, or sometimes, insurance claims were put in for both the film and the car that was damaged. So in November and December 1946, the MPAA and the US Army continued their negotiations on the JDC's acquisition of these detained American films. So at the same time, arrangements were made to send individual copies of films from the United States to Germany in the personal baggage of JDC officials. One such, this kind of personal couriering system kind of showed what was kind of bringing kind of the sentiment of the kind of society at the time. One such film was called Of These Our People of 1946, a 20-minute film about anti-Semitism in post-war America on 16mm by an American Jewish filmmaker, Sam Brody. It was produced by the communist-influenced Jewish People's Fraternal Order, and it explored what was said to be at the time the history of the Jew in America and the nature and causes of anti-Semitism. The film's self-reported purpose was to help combat the alarming increase in racial and religious tension and promote a better understanding of all minority groups. A breakthrough in relation to the detained films came in early January 1947, when the US Army and the MPAA agreed to turn over to the JDC 82 feature-length films that the Army was sitting on in Frankfurt. And you can imagine the impact of this release of these films. So the films were provided on the condition that entry to film screenings would be free of charge for DPs, and this kind of accounts for the figures that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And the JDC was going to be the sole custodian of these films until they were recalled or of no further use. What I will get to in a moment, this is some of the films that were included in the JDC's film screening program and made available to them, but there were many more than these ones. So now that the films were in hand, all that was missing were the vital supply elements, the vehicles, projectors, cinema technicians, and equipment. So this mobile zone-wide delivery prompted the JDC to ask the Army for essential equipment to establish 8 mobile motion picture units which would tour the displaced persons centres in the US zone of Germany. So this request was approved, and this meant that the film screening program was underway. So while the US zone was the most immediate area for this infusion of romances, thrillers, dramas and westerns, comedies and musicals, the JDC had plans to become the sole supplier of relief programming across other DP camps in Europe as well. So Herbert Schenker conveyed that confidence and this ambition to Morris Eigen in New York. He said, and I quote, "Mobile units have been set up to service all camps, and it is being planned for these units to go into Austria as well. At least 6 copies of each film could be used without fear of any overlapping, because Austria has nothing at all by way of films. We would like to supply other countries and would therefore appreciate your future endeavours in this direction." End of quote. So with the mobile film units now set up and access to films at hand, the delivery of this Filmers Relief program could proceed apace. So as I mentioned, the real game changer was the release of the US Army's films. There were 82 in this collection. So an extensive list of films available in Germany and in a warehouse in New York was sent to Ben Kaplan on December 12, 1946. The JDC appointed Bert Ansbein. He was employee of the Army Motion Picture Unit, who lived in New York to select, examine, and collect films for screening, which he did in the New York warehouse in late December 1946. So once they were selected, a purchase order was sent to the JDC's office in Paris. And then it kind of exemplifies this relief network between Paris, Munich, and New York, this transnational bureaucracy, from supply and identification, procurement, and payment to curation by individuals in New York, Paris, and Munich, and then screening and advertising to DPs in Germany and other countries. So on that note, the JDC's archival records are incomplete in relation to which films were screened from those sourced, meaning the lists that were made available in the JDC archives, as opposed to those which were screened, but I've been able to verify some of that information, which I will speak to later on, and where they were screened. So to do that, I've been accessing poster advertising records and collections from archives such as Yad Vashem and the Center for Jewish History as well. And these locations have been added to a digital map that I've included in chapter 5 of my book, of these screening locations. So based on the records of these 3 archives, I've created this poster gallery of some of the films that were made available to the JDC for film screenings. I've also created a YouTube channel that includes trailers of films that were made available through the JDC's film programmers. And so this is the movie posters, and then this list, it's a YouTube channel, and it has around 80 film trailers that can be viewed. And I'm not going to do that now, but these can be reviewed later on. So the films in this mobile cinematheque that I've called it circulated as would books in a library. So some sitting in the JDC's film library in Munich with occasional borrowings, while others were in high demand and had extremely limited screenings in one DP camp before being driven to another. So what began as an improvised system with a limited number of films in circulation in July 1946 expanded to a film screening program with 9 mobile units touring different areas across the US zone of Germany by November 1948. So these film screenings were skewed towards American productions, an unsurprising trend given the dominance of studio films from the United States. From February 1947, the JDC officials had access to this vast range of American films for their mobile units and selected the following for inclusion. I put the posters on the screen there: Affairs of Susan, The Hitler Gang, Love Letters, Skylark, Here Come the Waves, You Came Along, and Sullivan's Travels. Most of the American feature films made available were produced during the 1930s and 40s. Their themes included resistance, freedom struggles, communism, the Nazi past, and the Nuremberg trials. Films included the story of Louis Pasteur, made by an émigré director from Nazi Germany. We also have films about the Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 45. We also have biopics and some comedy romances and musicals. Rosemarie, The Hard-Boiled Canary, Seven Sweethearts. We also have films like The Valley of Decision. And the blockbuster Lassie Come Home regularly pulled in huge attendance figures. So, as mentioned, the much prized Yiddish films here were now available in the JDC library in Munich. They included The Cantor's Son, Green Fields, Merlo Efros, Two Sisters, Bar Mitzvah, The Purimspieler, Yiddle with His Fiddle, and many others, and several shorts as well. So by the end of 1949, this collection was extensive and included the golden age of Polish Yiddish and American Yiddish films. So I just want to turn now to just a few examples of what this film program kind of looked like and how it was advertised. And as I said, this is elaborated in more detail in my book, in chapter 5 in particular. So film posters from DP camps represent this material archive of the film screening program. The promotional posters were pasted to columns and building facades in highly trafficked areas of DP camps, and these alerted audiences to upcoming screenings, locations and times, but also through their typography and design, they told a compelling story of intertextual translation. So this one here, A Letter to Mother, a Brivlo to Mama, talks about, shows these two young children there, or teenagers, looking and pointing to the screening. While this photo might seem kind of staged or contrived, reflecting a promotional opportunity for the JDC, it points, however, to the film's vitality as a relief good. Yiddish and American films were used as clear mechanisms to connect displaced persons of all ages to life elsewhere, building solidarity with transnational and multilingual heartlands through film viewing. Just another example here is the film Bar Mitzvah. As I said, they're quite diverse in their typographic styles. They're containing different typography of professional printing, hand painting and handwriting, such as film strips and the JDC's blue and white logo. An example of this branding is from the joint, from its mobile film program included in the film Bar Mitzvah, advertising the title, the location, the starting times of 6 and 8, and one screening on the next day. And as I've mentioned before, that the kind of what accounted for the high demand of these films, well, not only for them was the kind of the free entry to them, and this was a condition of their use. And as I said, from these film posters from other archival organizations, I've been able to identify and geolocate the film screenings to particular DP camps, and this is followed up in my book. So a vital part of the supply of film screenings was its staffing from within resident Jewish DP communities and JDC staff. DP camp newspapers such as the Landsberger Lager Zeitung advertised for cinema operators and technicians, while Ort ran cinema operators training courses in DP camps. The large number of trainees was, of course, unlikely to service the demand across the entire US zone. And this is why the JDC used its own or recruited people to service the JDC, these mobile film units. So they were drawn from such visitors here as Rabbi Avram Alexander Rosenberg. They appointed the Czech-born Rosenberg, leader of an Orthodox synagogue in Yonkers in New York, as the first rabbi to enter Germany and assist with relief and provision of these religious services. And as you can see here, he's also helping out with cinema, setting up the cinema projector. The Jewish DPs often assisted the cinema operators too in setting up the cinema halls and screenings, as is evident in this next one, which forms the basis for the promotion for this talk. So you can see this was a kind of a crowdsourced, kind of participatory act in terms of volunteers from within the JDC, but also within resident staff. So I just want to go to kind of how large the actual JDC program was. So these are the figures, the numbers of the JDC's mobile film units and the areas in which they operated. So I'm going to present you with just some kind of figures here. So although comprehensive mileage and audience attendance data for the entire duration of the film program and its mobile units are not available, an indicative audit of the film relief program I'm going to itemize. So this is where they operated. And I've actually, on this slide, I've digitized these operations you can see in this slide. And when you go to this digital slide later on, you'll be able to click on all of those locations. It will tell you something about the displaced persons camp and also the relevant films that were shown in those locations. What I've also done is to try to give an indicative snapshot of estimate data based on the figures that were compiled in terms of the monthly report. So this slide, mileage for movies, includes the total distance and mileage of all vehicles in those 9 units, as you can see that I showed on the previous slide, in the delivery of the film program just between May and November 1948. And this is the kind of height of the operation of the film unit. And it doesn't include, obviously, the data for those previous years, but it just gives you a sense of the popularity there. It gives you the region of operation, the attendance, the number of shows, the average number of attendees per screening as well. So you can see here the film units total road mileage for all months between May and September 1948 of those 9 units there. And the average attendance there of 430 people per showing are quite phenomenal. What started out as a provisional relief enterprise in transient communities became a regular and widely popular entertainment with routinized zone-wide itineraries and even shifted into other zones on a smaller scale. But it did not reach the ambition that the JDC had initially hoped for. Now, Samuel Haber's monthly reports, these are the ones that I use to construct this audit, they also contain pertinent information about the kind of backstories. For example, a report from May 1948 notes that each mobile film unit is now equipped with a record player and Yiddish and Hebrew records, which are played before the pictures and between reels. So this expansion in cultural repertoire was no minor entertainment, as Yiddish and Hebrew records resonated with the territorial and cultural heartlands of DP's remembrance and aspirations. Reports from subsequent months mention political and cultural events that influence fluctuations in DP camp populations, namely the possibility of increased departures due to Israel's formation, the passage of the Displaced Persons Act in the United States, and the arrival of a local commission to facilitate prospective emigration. In the report for September 1948, Haber mentions that the film program had been extended to the French zone with 2 Yiddish films, in addition to serving Berlin and the British zone. A JDC research department report from December 1947 about cultural, religious, and educational activities in the British zone notes that the camp cinema of Belsen DP camp was open 4 times a week and offered films in English, German, and occasionally Russian. The figures for September 1948 are the highest over the 5-month period surveyed. The mobile film units servicing Stuttgart and Frankfurt recorded the greatest number of film-going DPs, number of shows, and mileage. The films that produced that impressive monthly result were eclectic: Kol Nidre, Bar Mitzvah, A Letter to Mother, I Wonder Who's Kissing Her Now, My Kingdom for a Cook, and Lassie Come Home. And data for some months fluctuated because vehicles were taken out for essential servicing. The statistical success and reach of the film program underscores the ongoing commitment of the JDC to deliver relief that mediated the needs of the organization's relief kind of remit in post-war Europe with those of the Central Committee of Liberated Jews and the DPs themselves. The reportage of that impact on Jewish DPs and those who worked in the mobile film units, however, is absent in many sources I've consulted, thus meriting the need for further mining of Yiddish and other sources in the next stage of the project. So the film program was still in operation in early 1949, though there were signs of scaling back as the number of DPs in camps dropped due to emigration to Israel and other countries. In early March 1949, Jacob Joslow wrote to Theodore Feder in New York to request guidance on the film program's future. Many of the films that formed part of the screening program were obtained on 2-year licenses. Owners were demanding to know whether they would still be needed, and the Paris office had not yet set up a budget pipeline for the films. Still, Joslow was informed from the field that films are still the best part of our recreational program. And he also supported having some Yiddish films renewed for use, of the 40 or so of them that was due to expire, but only have those that would make a genuine contribution to the program in Germany. Most of the 100 or so English language titles circulating in Germany were recommended for immediate return to the United States. The challenges encountered and overcome in the film screening program were a vivid commitment of the JDC to Holocaust survivors and, less explicitly stated at the time, to film as a vehicle to rehumanize the self after years of besiegement and persecution. Film viewing offered spaces for reprieve, togetherness, and memory making. As we've seen, the JDC's mobile film units and the screenings they delivered provided a vital lifeline to Jewish DPs, who, in their insatiable demand for cinema, emerged as vibrant, borderless cultural citizens of the world. Yet the scale and topical diversity of the JDC's vast screening program is more than a scholarly topic. As we have seen, not only was the JDC's film screening program one of the largest and most ambitious relief efforts mounted in the US zone of post-war Germany, it also diverted Jewish DP's attention from a tough, if not unwelcoming world to which they would eventually, and if not anxiously, return. Thank you very much.
Simone, thank you for an informative, educational, enlightening, amazing lecture. I know the audience enjoyed it as much as I did. And we'll go to the chat to see if there's any questions. And if anyone has any questions now, you can certainly feel free to type them in. So an anonymous attendee writes, what percentage of DTs spoke or understood Yiddish? Great question.
Yeah, this is a question. Well, it depends on the DP camp population that you're speaking about and their kind of origins. But I would say of the kind of surviving communities, this varied, but a very high percentage of them did. It really depended on the DP camps and the zones in which you were kind of talking about and their origins. But the exact percentages I don't have.
Jeffrey Edelstein writes, during the DP period, JDC was itself making films, principally for fundraising purposes in the United States. Have you found any evidence to confirm that and to that the films were also shown, besides being in the US, at the DP camps?
Well, I've actually looked at some of these films for other chapters in my book, but I haven't actually seen the evidence of these other films being screened. I mean, there were a few of JDC films that actually did tours of other countries that I've looked at, but whether or not these films were screened within the DP camps, because they were kind of fundraising films really for external audiences. So there were different kind of motivations of those particular JDC produced films, as opposed to this was more of an American and Yiddish import into the DP camps.
Thank you. Our next question kind of goes back to back with the first question asked, which may answer the percentage of Yiddish-speaking attendees at the theater. Are there any films in other languages, or excuse me, is there any indication that the films in Yiddish were better attended than films in perhaps other languages?
Again, this is the data where it's kind of not really revealed in the JDC archives, this kind of attendance data. And I think this would be a question that would be answered probably by more research into kind of survivor perspectives or DPs at the time. But again, the audience figures that I gave, I have done some estimations of these films, but the American films were very popular as well. But I'm not sure if the JDCs have they actually mapped the title of the film screened to the actual number of attendees. But again, this is a topic for further research.
Thank you. Leah Drawer is asking, I wonder now if some movies were shown at the Masada School in Darmstadt, 1947 to 48. I never thought of asking, but this is interesting. The school received supplies from the JDC directly and through Frankfurt. Is that something that you would be able to answer, Simone?
I can't answer it right now without further research, but I'd be happy to to follow up directly on this.
Okay, and Leah will also have our archives team check on that for you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I believe our final question, no, it's not our final question, but James Carnegie wants to ask, what do you think despite the prominence of Yiddish language cinema in these programs of the DPs, why this might not have resulted in a long-term revival of Yiddish language cinema in Europe or elsewhere? Just a
Yeah,
question.
yeah, it's a good question. It's it's difficult to know. They did screen, some of these Yiddish films, Lang is the Weg and a few others, but yeah, the revival of post-war Yiddish, or the lack thereof, of kind of post-war Yiddish films, also because of the lack of speakers who stayed in Europe, I guess, and Yiddish kind of film production. But I'm quite sure that this would have to be situated in the national film cultures of those countries, in Polish, French, even Hungarian cinema as well, because I'm sure that there kind of might have been, but the kind of reasons for the disconnect or the lack of continuity are kind of greater than this film program, so to speak. It's also the kind of directors involved, and there were some, but certainly not the revival of what there once was. Yeah.
Someone on one of our audience members, or you may know, what was the top Yiddish movie that was played in the United States? Do you know? Any idea at our theaters here?
I'm not sure, but I think the JDC, the National Centre for Jewish Film at Brandeis, would know possibly some of this, because they have screened a lot of this in their kind of cinematics. And I think this would be an interesting kind of parallel to examine what's happening in the United States in relation to film viewing and what's happening in the DP camps.
I agree with you, yes. Ruth Shane asks, when was the film program closed?
So this was closed in kind of late 1949, when the kind of licenses for certain films were beginning to expire, and the number of the DPs in these camps were kind of being reduced due to immigration. But the JDC was committed to expanding this program as well, and it was really only for the lack of supply that vehicles and films that this wasn't able to eventuate.
Thank you. And our last question, which was actually a question I was interested in, what sparked your interest in this whole area, the theater, the showing of the movies in the DP camps?
So sorry about that. So I've been working on this book for quite a while, and the DP topic, I mean, most of the book that I look at is about this kind of cinematic landscape of how Jewish refugees and displaced persons were kind of depicted as kind of objects and agents. But this was a kind of topic that I got interested in by chance, in a way, when I was looking through these archives, and I was working on a film, These Are the People, and this was again a film about DPs. But there was such a huge kind of story there to be told about how film can kind of service individual human needs, as we all know, in terms of film viewing. But this was something that really spoke to how displaced persons were agents of their own film viewing, and kind of co-curators in a way of what they wanted, to watch. And it really told the story of them, they're just ordinary people wanting to go to the cinema in this kind of environment of rebuilding, of mourning for the past, but also uncertainty about the future. It provided a real kind of a diversion, but a kind of surrogate connection to the outside world. And I think this is the thing that really struck me, was the enormous effort in kind of ensuring that this happened, but also in kind of transcending borders and universalizing the film going experience.
Thank you, Simone. And I know today a lot of us go to the cinema for those very reasons, for escape, enjoyment, to take us to a different place. It can be very healing. Thank you again for everything you've done and for this great lecture. And I know that everyone enjoyed it. It was a very lovely presentation.
Thank you.
And it has been recorded, and it'll be available on the JDC Archives website and on the YouTube channel in about 3 weeks. Our next program will take place on November 6th. Information is in the chat. Joanna Newman will be our speaker. She'll give a lecture on how the JDC became involved in the rescue to the British Caribbean during the Nazi period. This will be the first program in a new JDC Archives webinar series on Latin America and the Caribbean, the Jewish experience in the 20th century. You can register for this program via the link in the chat box, which is up now. And we hope that you and many others will be able to join us. In addition, I encourage you, if you have not signed up for our e-newsletter, to do so and be included in our mailing lists. Thank you all. Thank you, Simone. Am Yisrael Chai.